Hi students, this is chapter 15, Reconstruction, and this chapter is our first chapter in 1302. If you haven't taken 1301 in a while, you may want to go back to chapter 14 and just kind of breeze through it a little bit to get an idea of what the American Civil War was, especially if you have never taken American history before. But now we are at the point where the country has ripped itself apart, and it's going to have to somehow come back together if the country is going to be the United States. And that's going to be very difficult. So I have a question for you. Why didn't the North and South reunite quickly and peacefully after the Civil War? Now, this may seem obvious to you, and you may be thinking, I don't think we really need to ponder this, but I ask this question because as a student, especially in high school, as a high school student, I felt like our textbooks were really very descriptive about the Civil War, and then kind of were like, and there's Reconstruction, it happened, but we're all good now. And one of the reasons for that is Reconstruction is very difficult to talk about because of the aftermath of the war and the political issues that are going to come up during Reconstruction. And so, it deserves more than a few pages. So I just want you to think about that question as we move forward. All right, so here's one reason why they just could not move on, or as Lincoln really wants them to do, forgive and forget before he is shot. These are Civil War doctors, and I like this picture I have for you over here on the right. Hygiene during the Civil War is very different than our modern day hygiene, although it doesn't mean that people always follow the procedures they're supposed to in terms of hygiene. But here I'm mostly talking about surgical hygiene. Now, in the 1850s in Austria, hand washing is something that is discovered as a way to prevent disease from spreading. But the United States is going to be a little slower on board with that, and just the concept of getting everyone to wash their hands is certainly going to take much longer. As you know, today, people still don't wash their hands. So just the concept is out there during the Civil War, but it is certainly not going to be practiced in the same way that it would be in a medical research hospital, I think is what I'm getting at there. And there are a lot of amputations during the Civil War. The mini ball is going to cause some very serious wounds. The mini ball would flatten out, and unlike the earlier musket ball, it would shatter the bone when it hit bone. And so bone fragments would go through a person's skin and into their body. I mean, the bone is already in the body. I'm not describing that well. So once the mini ball hits your bone, it splinters, there we go, further into the body, which causes damage to your soft tissue and your organs. And so it made some pretty grisly wounds that were very difficult to operate on. A lot of people, because there is a very high casualty rate during the Civil War, a lot of people do not survive. But many people will have a limb or multiple limbs amputated during this period of time. And the reason that they amputate limbs is to try to keep an infection from spreading to the heart. So they don't want an infection to spread throughout the body or for a patient to go septic and get blood poisoning. So that's why they will take off an extremity with a wound that is they don't feel like they can mend. And Civil War doctors are not terribly prepared for life on the battlefield. Of the 11,000 Northern physicians, only 500 of them had performed surgery. This is one statistic for you. And the Confederacy is even worse off. 3,000 of their physicians, only 27 had performed surgery prior to the Civil War. So there's a lot of learning on the job, and that's stressful, I guess, to say the least, to both the patient and the physician. There is a nickname for the doctors, Dr. Sawbones, that is used to describe them because they do use a pretty serious bone saw that I will show you on the next slide. But patients tended to feel kind of comforted if their doctor came in covered in blood. Today, we would not feel so comforted. However, this meant that this person had performed the operation before and you weren't the first one. You weren't the experiment, right? So there was some comfort in that. And we have two prison camps that you should be aware of, Andersonville and Camp Douglas. Andersonville was the southern prison camp for Union or Northern soldiers. Andersonville is a horrible place. It is a very crowded fort. There's no kind of shelter from the elements, meaning like they're enclosed in a fort fence, but there's no like roof to where they are kept. Some of them do have tents, but the amount of people who will be crowded into Andersonville make it unlivable. If the conditions before could be called livable, they certainly aren't after the number of people captured are going to be there. And as you might expect from an overcrowded prison camp, there's a lot of disease and death. In addition to this, Andersonville has a starvation problem, which the South has a starvation problem. But a man named Henry Wirtz, he is the prison commandant, and he is going to be the only person tried for war crimes after the Civil War for his treatment of the prisoners at Andersonville. He would come into the camp and he would say, if you'll fight for the other side, you can come with me. I'll arm you in Confederate gear, put those thoughts of being a Union soldier behind you, and you'll get food and etc. Well, it's a trick. There is no bread. They would take them out from, if they had volunteers that would agree to go with him, they would take them out and shoot them in front of the prison camp. So, kind of unbelievably, there are survivors of the Andersonville prison camp. The human spirit is impressive. And if you live through that experience, that is certainly not something that you are going to forget. Camp Douglas, on the other hand, is the northern camp. Now, Camp Douglas is not as bad as Andersonville. To be clear, they're both prison camps, and neither one is pleasant. But Camp Douglas is going to feed the prisoners because they can. That's part of the reason. And they are going to have shelter. Now, are they going to be roughed up and mistreated by the soldiers? Yes. But they aren't experiencing the same kind of horror that is happening at Andersonville. So we have some amendments that you should keep in mind, but before I go into those amendments, I just kind of wanted to summarize what we've talked about on those last few slides, that, these are just a few of the reasons that I feel like just right out the gate that it is very difficult to move on. It's very difficult to see yourself as one country. With all of just with this, and we haven't even gotten to all of the political and racial issues that happen after the Civil War either. We're getting there, but just this alone, these three things that we just talked about, that's enough. So I put these here for you. You should know all three of these amendments. They are good for you to know for life, and also good for you to know for your quiz. So the 13th Amendment is adopted in 1865, and it says that no slavery or servitude shall exist within the United States. The 14th Amendment is adopted a year later, and it provides citizenships to ex-slaves, and it protected equal rights for all citizens. And the 15th Amendment, which is adopted in 1869, grants African Americans the right to vote. And at the time, it would be men, African American men. Just in case you didn't know, in the United States at this time, before the 15th Amendment, only white men could vote. There were no property requirements. Those are done away with during Jacksonian America, so you could be poor or you could be rich, but you just have to be white. Women cannot vote yet. That hasn't happened. So this is, the 15th Amendment is kind of a big deal, although it's not going to be as effective as it should have been. Okay, so this is our first plan for Reconstruction. This is Lincoln's 10% plan. Now, towards the end of the war, in 1863, Lincoln is going to already be thinking about a plan to reunite the United States. And so he is going to put together something called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And he said that states could re-enter the Union when 10% of qualified voters took an oath of loyalty. 10% of qualified voters. How many percent does that leave out? If my math is correct, 90. That's a lot of people who don't have to say that they will be loyal to the United States. That's most of the South. So radical Republicans in Congress, they say this proposal is far too lenient, Lincoln. You can't just allow only 10% of qualified voters to vote. They could easily then get into higher political offices again, and then where will we be when they rebel in a few more years? So Lincoln, this actually is not going to come to pass. The president and Congress are working out a compromise on this when he is assassinated. But I think it's important to look at what Lincoln's plan doesn't do, because these are things that if, say, there was a treasonous movement today in the United States, these are some things that typically happen. So the fact that they don't happen is a little surprising. There's not a mass arrest of high civilian or military officials, meaning the cabinet of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, they are not going to be arrested for treason or executed for treason. In fact, there are really no trials for treason. And there are some, well, I'm going to leave that there. There's no trials for treason. And so you can kind of see there, I think, why that would be unsettling to Congress. And it does not extend social or political rights to ex-slaves. Now, this may surprise you. I don't know if it does or not. It used to surprise students because Lincoln is the president that passes the Emancipation Proclamation. And he is against the institution of slavery. This is true. But Lincoln is not quite so altruistic or, campaigning for racial equality as he is sometimes painted to be. He's certainly, against slavery continuing in the United States, but he's not like, he's not like leading the protest, I guess, is the best way I can think to summarize that. And so one of the things that he doesn't want to do is try to address the fact that there are all of these former slaves who are now free, who need help because they don't have anything. And they not only need help in terms of food and shelter and, all of that, but they also need protection because they are still in the South, and it's not like Southern feelings about race changed overnight. So there is no federal assistance that's going to be supplied to them, and they need that because if you're starting with nothing, if you are going to have something, you're going to need some way to get land, some way to farm, some way to buy tools and seeds. If you're going to do something else, you also need some kind of resources. But Lincoln doesn't want to make the South mad because he feels like it will take longer to bring the country back together, and that the issue of the rights of former slaves is something that can be negotiated once the country comes back together. So Congress responds to Lincoln with the Wade-Davis bill, and they pass this in Congress in 1864, and they say, all right, Lincoln, listen, 10%, way too low. 50% of the voters in each state in the South must take an oath of allegiance before Restoration begins. That's a more comforting number. Lincoln still feels like that's too many. And those who never supported the Confederacy can vote for delegates to a constitutional convention. Now, that's a tricky one. That sounds good in theory, like no one who supported this treasonous movement can join the Constitutional Convention. Except that, who didn't fight for the Confederacy in the South? I mean, there are people. There's certainly pockets of people who are white and didn't fight for the Confederacy, and former slaves, people of color, didn't fight for the Confederacy. But most people in the South did fight for the Confederacy, and so this is really limiting Southerners in their ability to participate in the federal government. And again, Congress is not going to grant suffrage or the right to vote to African Americans in the Wade-Davis bill. Like Lincoln, they want to bring the South in first and then deal with the problems there in their terms, not in my terms, the issues of what to do with former slaves. What do we do now that they're free? And Lincoln thinks this is too harsh, and then he vetoes it. And then he is assassinated. Okay, he's shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater, and Booth is an actor and an ardent Southerner who abhors Lincoln. The assassination attempt is actually part of a larger plot where Andrew Johnson, his vice president pictured here, was also supposed to be shot, but he was not, and so was the Secretary of State. And the reason those two men were not shot is because the people shooting them just couldn't go through with it. So Booth is the only one that actually upholds his end of the deal. And Johnson is not Lincoln. And Johnson was from Tennessee. Originally, he was from North Carolina, but he was representing Tennessee when he was elected vice president. And they put him on the ticket because Tennessee is a southern state. And if you think back, the election of Lincoln in 1860 was such a problem because since Lincoln had come out against slavery and the slavery in the United States, don't mean to stutter, the Southerners were so angry they didn't put him on the ballot. So this was having Johnson be the vice president is an attempt to kind of be like, ooh, Southerners, let us woo you back to the voting booth. We will have a Northerner and a Southerner, but that still didn't really work out very well since the Civil War started. But Johnson is a very interesting character. He was not a wealthy man. He was born into poverty, and he couldn't read until his wife taught him to read and write. And he becomes a successful politician in Tennessee, but he is not an abolitionist at all. He did not care about that issue. And that's kind of a problem, especially during Reconstruction, because the issue of the end of slavery really needs to be taken care of. So the fact that he is not interested in that is a problem. So what I consider our second wave of Reconstruction after Lincoln's 10% plan is presidential Reconstruction from 1865 to 1867. And this is Johnson's plan. And Johnson says, okay, I've got an idea. As a kid, Johnson hated rich people. They were mean to him, they made fun of him, he was poor and white, and he now is in a position where he's the president. And all those people who kicked dirt in his face and laughed at him and lived in these big fancy houses, now they have to answer to him. So he goes on a crazy ego trip where he's going to say, that if high Confederate officials who had property over $20,000, if they want to be readmitted to the United States, they are going to have to apply for an individual pardon, a personal pardon. They will have to show up to the White House, and this long handwritten, remember, still handwriting, handwritten pardon will have to be drawn up, and then they have to sort of kneel before me and say, "Oh, Johnson, I'm so sorry for leaving the Union." And he says, "Kiss my ring," right? This is not an efficient plan. Additionally to that, a loyalty oath must be sworn by white Confederates to get back their rights. So this is kind of doing away with the percentage of how many. It's just saying, no, they have to all swear in loyalty. So this is what he's preoccupied with. He's caught up with this. And every day that he's accepting these individual pardons is one more day that the important kind of tangible daily needs of Reconstruction are not being met. For instance, the food problem, the shelter problem, problems of safety, all these things, people are like, hey though, we need some assistance. And so while all of this is going on, people are suffering in the South. That's a good place to leave that. So informally, he declared that, Southerners should renounce ordinances of secession. That means they should say, "We're sorry, we left. That was treasonous. We won't do it again." That they would need to repudiate their Confederate debt or pay back their debt. Now, in fairness to the South, this is one they actually can't really do very well right now. They're having serious financial problems from the war and from creating their own currency. And they had to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. So essentially, they have to admit that slavery is over because they're not admitting that. But this is all informally, off the record, not written down or enforced. So if I said, I'm going to expect by Friday that all of you write a 20-page research paper, but it's not for a grade, and it's not in the syllabus, would you do it? One of you just said yes and nodded your head because you strive for perfection and you want to make sure that you do everything right. But most of you would be like, no, I'm not going to do that. So, informally declaring these things is not the same as actually taking care of them. This doesn't work. I know, you're shocked. But Confederates are going to walk all over Johnson. They do say, okay, well, we were sorry for secession. We apologize. We really don't want that 13th Amendment, though. We really like to keep slavery. So 13th Amendment, not so valid in the South. And then they say, we're not going to pay our debts, which, again, that's really the only one that's somewhat reasonable. And then Johnson allows former Confederate leaders to be elected to Congress. So this is also problematic because this is what Republicans in Congress were worried about, was that someone who just committed treason and lost a treasonous uprising, essentially, now is just back in Congress getting to make important decisions for the country. So it's concerning. And Johnson is having to issue so many pardons that they could not get the papers from former Confederates out fast enough. Those poor writers, their hands were cramping, and they said, this is not so efficient. And so this is very important, and I have an image over here for you that I don't expect you to be able to read the text, but you might be able to. And this image is a set of black codes, and there are some, I believe, that are also linked in a primary document in your textbook. Now, every state had its own black codes, but they're all very similar, although they do vary a little bit state to state. So here's what they do. These codes are designed to restrict freedoms of now freed African Americans in the South. So now, ex-slaves, they must work. Now, I know you're thinking, well, that doesn't sound so bad, because I've certainly had students say that in the past. And you're right, working is not bad, but in order to actually work in the South, what has to happen for these former slaves? I mean, somebody has to hire them, right? And the amount of racism in the South is going to really prevent that, because white landowners are not going to want to hire someone who used to work for them for free. And so that's a problem. Now, if you are not working, you can get in a lot of trouble if you are black on the street, because you can be picked up for something called vagrancy. And this is kind of like the charge of loitering. I mean, it's like you're out and about and you shouldn't be, essentially. And then you go to jail, and then you work doing heavy agricultural labor in prison. So this is very limiting, and also very much forceful in that it is kind of forcing freed slaves back into the positions of being more like slaves, and kind of making slavery happen again, sort of unofficially, but kind of officially. Also, black men and women in the South are denied the right to testify in court. They have separate penal codes or law codes, and they cannot own property. They don't have the right to get married, and they don't have the right to sue or be sued. This is pretty much all of their civil rights, which have now been taken away. So technically, according to the Emancipation Proclamation, they are still free, legally, on paper. But these black codes are going to really create an environment where it doesn't matter that there's the Emancipation Proclamation, because these are restricting newly freed blacks from being able to have any kind of a life in the South. So one thing you can look for as a little mini historian is if there's ever any kind of legislation that won't allow people to marry or buy property or sue, or, if they have a curfew, things like that. Those should be big red flags to you that there is something going on and someone is being oppressed. There's some kind of injustice that is happening to that particular group of people. So that's kind of a good tell that things aren't right. Well, Republicans in Congress, they decide that they do want civil and political rights for African Americans, and there are several reasons for this. I think, one just to share with you is that, they want a voting bloc in the South, and freed blacks are certainly not going to be voting for the Southern Democratic candidate. Because that is the white supremacist candidate who's like 13th Amendment's not a thing. And at this time, our parties are very, very regional. So if you're a Democrat, you're probably from the South. If you're a Republican, you're a Northerner. And so this is the hope that there will be a big voting bloc of black men in the South. And Congress tries to bring up with Johnson the fact that he's being awfully lenient with ex-Confederates, and they get frustrated at the fact that he continually will veto any kind of bill that would protect or benefit African Americans at all. And they're like, we're not moving forward. And so they decide we need somebody else. Johnson is not helping the country come back together. He's not doing what we want, so let's try to impeach him. So here is a ticket from the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. So if you wanted to go, you would need to show one of these. And he is going to be brought to an impeachment trial. However, he is not going to be found guilty. So here's what he does. He tries to dismiss the Secretary of War, who is Edwin Stanton, and he wants to replace him with Grant because he likes Grant, and he gets along better with Grant. Well, Congress creates the Tenure of Office Act, And this act says that the Senate must approve the removal of cabinet officers. And so this is why the House will impeach Johnson, but it has a hard time of convicting him because they have to show that he committed an indictable or criminal act. And he did violate the Tenure of Office Act, but that's not really a criminal act that they can justify in removing him from the presidency. So he's actually acquitted, but it serves its purpose in that it takes away all of the power from Johnson and will then put Reconstruction in the hands of Congress. And congressional Reconstruction is the final phase of Reconstruction. And this goes on for 10 years. So it's not 5 pages, it's 10 years that Southern states will be under military control. Black adult men must be allowed to vote, according to congressional Reconstruction. Former Confederate officials, they just can't vote. They can't hold political office. They can't do any of that. States have to ratify the 14th Amendment, and really the 13th Amendment too. And then, and only then, could a state send a representative to Congress. So now the military is occupying the South. The military is ensuring that if you are black, you receive some protection during the day. But they go to bed. And at night, we see a lot of terror and the rise of the KKK. So there is an attempt to try to help with the problems that come from an end of slavery, like the need for food and clothing and shelter. And so Lincoln does form a temporary agency before he dies in 1865 called the Freedmen's Bureau. And Congress is concerned. I mean, they have some concerns about, what's going on. And this Freedmen's Bureau built schools. And so over 1,000 schools were created, and they taught reading using the Bible, and they taught arithmetic. And so this is an important moment because many black children in the South are going to learn to read, and the literacy rate is going to go up. However, these schools have a very hard time operating because they get burned down, and things happen to the teachers who work in them. Whether they are white or black, they are supporting educating black children, and therefore they are the enemy. Another thing that he does is he works on coming up with a contract, which is the sharecroppers contract. Now, sharecropping is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's sharing a portion of the crop to pay for your expenses. So it's kind of what this labor system of sharecropping becomes the new way to survive if you are black in the South. You go to a white landowner, you rent land from him, you use his company store, he extends you credit, you're probably in debt forever, your bill just keeps getting longer and longer, you really can never leave or get out of it, although technically you could, but probably not, with the reality of debt. And so this is a system that is going to look an awful lot like slavery, but it is not exactly the same as slavery because during sharecropping, wages are paid. Oh, and it is different because it is different on paper, I guess is what I'm trying to say, than slavery. But it feels like slavery because there is not a lot of choice and there's an awful lot of abuses of power. So I included some excerpts from Martin Delaney's sharecropping contract, which he would send with members of the Freedmen's Bureau to advocate for black sharecroppers. And if you read this contract, you can think about, well, what does that mean people were doing? Why would you have to put this in your contract? What were those landowners doing? So the first one is no labor is to be performed by hand that can be better done by animal labor or machinery. So what do you think white landowners were doing? So this essentially what's happening is instead of using an ox or a horse or a donkey, they're using a person to carry a really heavy load. And that is something that Delaney believes is not right. That should not happen. Another point is all damage for injury or loss of property by carelessness is to be paid by fair and legal assessment. This is because you're in debt at the company store, and if your shovel breaks because they sold you a really flimsy, crappy shovel, and then suddenly you're like, well, I need a new shovel from the store, and they're like, what'd you do with your other shovel? Oh, you broke your shovel. Well, now this shovel's going to cost double what you paid for the first shovel. And so this happens a lot. And so, this is the idea of, well, if there is a destruction of property, we need to be able to use the court system. Let's skip the third one there and go to no stores will be permitted on the place and nothing sold on account except the necessaries of life, such as good substantial food and working clothes. Spirituous liquors will not be permitted. One student last semester said, Martin Delaney sounds like he was no fun, no spirituous liquors, huh? There's a pretty significant reason why he wants this. For one thing, spirituous liquors run up your tab at the company store. Also, if you have purchased spirituous liquors and you get into a disagreement or the white landowner wants to pick a fight with you, they can say, well, they were drunk and disorderly, and I know, and they bought all this alcohol from me. So that's part of the reason why he is against the spirituous liquors. But what are the necessaries of life? What does it mean to have good, substantial food? I think what does it mean to have good, substantial food is like an entire philosophical debate for another day. But that simply just means nutritional food. So what's happening is that, company stores are not providing things that will provide nutrition. Whether it's spoiled produce or there's no salt or, things like that. Those kinds of things have to be provided. There has to be access to those things. And then I'll let you read that last one there. And there are some questions in your additional reading packet if you want to look through that about Delaney's sharecropping contract. But again, my little mini historians, one thing to keep in mind here is that when you're looking at law codes like we looked at or this sharecropping contract, we call those primary documents in history. But also, they really tell you a lot about what is going on by the kinds of things that they prohibit or, want. And again, this is just a slide for you that's really about some of the things that we've already talked about in terms of sharecropping. It is true that white farmers also sharecrop. That is true. And that tenant farmers have been doing that for a while in the South. And there are a lot of poor white people in the South. That's also true. But the difference is that poor white people are going to be given a fairer deal and not purposely persecuted because they are a certain color. Meaning that because black sharecroppers are black, they're going to be cheated at every turn. And that's not going to happen in the same way for white sharecroppers. However, their daily life is very similar in terms of the kind of work that they do. They're doing the same kind of work. It's just you have to add the terror of the KKK when you think about black sharecropping, and that, changes the situation pretty drastically. So, in the election of 1868, Grant is going to win. He is a war hero. He's very popular in the North. And he wins by a very narrow margin, but he still does win. And This image here on the right is very famous in terms of representing the 1868 election. And you can see that we have three men holding hands. They seem united in their cause, and they are standing on someone. So I'll let you take that in for a minute and try to decide, what am I looking at? Who are these people? So you have the rich, wealthy banker, you've got the southern farmer, white farmer, and then you have somebody that looks very strange. They look kind of animalistic. It doesn't really look like that person on the end has a human face like the other two characters, and that is how they depict the Irish in political cartoons around this time. The Irish are not well liked when they begin to come over, especially during the Irish famine in the 1840s. And so, because of the Irish famine, there are going to be a lot of Irish immigrants that come in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. And they, despite what you may have heard, they were not slaves. That was not the case. I had a student that asked me that last time. What about the white slaves? What about the Irish slaves? No, no, no. They may have come over earlier as indentured servants, but that is also different than slavery. But the Irish are treated really badly. There's signs in windows that say no Irish need apply. It's hard for them to make a living, and they are not considered white in terms of who has power. And this election is going to say, actually, we're going to embrace the Irish. The Irish immigrants, they can be white. We'll get them on this team, and so all at the expense of the black man who they are standing on top of. So this makes race a very central issue of the election, and it makes it very clear that moving forward, it doesn't really matter about your economic status, even though it really does matter. Wealthy people don't want you to think that at the time or now. They want you to believe that you should hold their beliefs because they are just like you, and they never are, unless you're also rich. Hold on one second. Let me drink some water. And I have to have you hold for me because if I stop it, I won't be able to keep going. This is an exciting journey where you have to record everything all at once. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say about that, so I'm going to forward. And carpetbaggers and scallywags are two terms that are associated with the Civil War. Carpetbaggers are northern businessmen that are going to come down to the South looking to start businesses for a profit. And they're called carpetbaggers because they actually have a carpet bag. If you've seen Mary Poppins, you've probably seen this. She has a carpet bag, and it's essentially a rug that you attach handles to, and then it's like a suitcase. So, although their carpet bags did not have such mystery and wonder, and were not supercalifragilistic, scallywags are returning Southern businessmen looking for a profit and to profit from Reconstruction. So these are Southerners, but it's very unpopular because it's like, well, okay, when the going got tough, you left, and now you came back just to profit off of our misery. So neither one of these two groups of people are well liked in the South. And then we have Henry Grady. Henry Grady has a dream, the New South dream. And Henry Grady really would like the South to industrialize. And he believes that if the South industrializes, it will be helpful in moving the South forward. He's the managing editor of the Atlanta Constitution, and he's hoping that it will bring jobs and Northern investment. Now, I say he's moderate on racial issues, and what I mean by that is he is not the head of the KKK, but he is certainly not Abraham Lincoln. He is a Southerner. He is what you would call racist today. But in terms of, is he riding out with the Klan? No. At least not that I know of. He might be. I don't know. It's hard to say. But he did found Georgia Tech, too, so I feel like it's worth mentioning. This fails, though. The New South Stream fails, and there's some reasons for this. The South only had a 10% urban population, but it had fewer large cities, and it just had fewer small towns. It's mostly rural. So hard to say. Rural. There we go. Sharecropping had made it very clear that there was a racially divided workforce. Although, in all fairness, there was already a racially divided workforce, so I don't know if we can say that sharecropping is the, I don't know, the main cause of that. And this would mean that factories would have to be somehow racially segregated. So are they on different floors, different buildings? How are we going to do this? And it is not as profitable to build two factories instead of one. And there's an educated middle class that is missing from the South. The South spends less on schooling, and Southern workers on the whole are uneducated and unskilled. Now, obviously, that's on the whole. There are people in the South who are educated, but the South does have a lot of illiteracy at this time. Which brings us to the Klan. And I'll put it in your Google Drive folder, I think. That's what I'll do with it. There is a really good documentary called The Ku Klux Klan, A Secret History. It's a little bit old now, but the part that I like for you to watch is the historical part, especially, because it really does a nice job of telling you about how the KKK emerges in the United States. So you are probably, unfortunately, familiar with the images of the Klan, that they wear these white robes and they have, they're a white supremacist group and they burn crosses. But here's how they get started. So the whole purpose behind the Klan organizing at this time is to keep blacks from voting. That is the main goal of the Klan in the 1860s and 70s. Later, the Klan is going to get a much broader, I should say, agenda, meaning there'll be all kinds of people on the KKK list that are unacceptable, including immigrants, divorced women, Catholics, Jews, there's a long list. But for now, it really is just blacks in the South. Keep them from the voting booths so that we can regain control of the South. And so there are hooded night rides where they begin visiting any active Republicans, and that would be black Republicans, that voted in the 1868 presidential election. And it is designed to try to just undermine the northern or the Republican state government and control. And the KKK, the KKK is a terrorist organization, and I'm trying to think of how to word this in the right way off the top of my head here. The KKK is a terrorist organization because they terrorize individuals. They would leave them notes that would be a warning. They would break in and beat them. They would kill them. And there's not any kind of recourse for that because even if the government of the state thinks that's too far, which they don't really, but even if they say, well, I wouldn't personally want to ride out and do that job myself, they approve of what they're doing because the South as a whole wants to return to the way life was before the Civil War, and that includes slavery. And so nobody is going to stand up to the Klan in the South. The North does know that the Klan exists, and does try to take some action with the Ku Klux Act and the Enforcement Act, but it becomes difficult to find out who all of the members are. The members of the KKK will all sort of protect each other, and it becomes kind of a very arduous search for all of them. They do put some members of the KKK in jail with the Enforcement Act, but the jails get really full. And as we're approaching the end of Reconstruction, the North, just the country in general, is really focused on some different plans. And so this is very unfortunate and tragic for African Americans, because any of the rights that they did gain during Reconstruction, they're going to be ripped away by black codes and then also ripped away by the Klan, to where if you exercised any of your new civil rights, the amendments that are still there on paper, you have the very high risk of being murdered. And I think, especially right now, I think this is a pretty important topic in our class. The aftermath of Reconstruction and what happens with the Klan and what happens with the black codes sets up a system of inequality in the United States, and it sets up an era called the Jim Crow era. And this creates not only an unequal system for African Americans in the South, but it creates a dangerous system, a systemic racism, where they're going to be second class. They're going to live in fear of being murdered and lynched in the South. And this is going to happen a lot in the South. So, in terms of what we see currently going on with, a lot of riots and racial violence, this is the history that it stems from. Certainly a history of slavery, but, since we're talking about Reconstruction, definitely throw that in there. And, of course, the later Jim Crow era. So, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm outside because I like being outside, and there is a crow that has a lot of feelings right now, and I don't know if you can hear him, but he really would like to interrupt our session. Okay, so, the Jim Crow laws. Beginning in 1876, there are going to be these new laws that are voting restrictions, and they really are still, you can still think of them as black codes because that's what they are. Poll taxes, that means you have to pay to vote, and a literacy test. You now have to pass a literacy test in most southern states to vote. Now, that doesn't sound so bad. When you think about, should voters be able to read and write? That would probably be good because then they can probably make good decisions. That's not so bad. But these literacy tests are going to be so corrupt and designed specifically to keep people of color from voting. If the literacy test didn't get you, didn't hold you back, if somehow you managed to pass the literacy test, the grandfather clause is then used. And the grandfather clause says if your grandfather voted in 1860, then you could vote. So, if your grandfather was a slave, you could not vote. And so these effectively disenfranchise, which means taking away the vote from African Americans, even though technically, federally, they can legally vote, but they can't vote in southern states. So I wanted to show you an example of the literacy test, and you can Google these. There's some for each state. This one's Louisiana. I think there's one in your textbook about Mississippi. I'll have to double check that. But this is what it would be like. So it says this test is to be given to anyone who cannot prove a 5th grade education. Do what you are told in each statement, nothing more, nothing less. Be careful as one wrong answer denotes failure of the test. You have 10 minutes to complete the test. Now there are more than 6 questions. I just stopped there. So these are the kinds of questions they had to answer. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. What? Draw a line under the last word of this line. Cross out the longest word in this line. Draw a line around the shortest word in this line. Circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. In the space below, draw 3 circles. One inside engulfed by the other. It just goes on and on like this. Now, does this have anything to do with educational literacy, like how the government works, or, what is the president? What does that mean? Of course not, because these are so contradictory. The questions contradict each other throughout the whole test, making it impossible to pass the literacy test. And I don't actually know the statistics of African Americans that did pass the literacy test. I don't know. Now I feel like I should look that up, but you should look that up too and let me know, because I don't know if that happened. So these are the kinds of tests they're going to be given. And we talk about this again when I talk about eugenics, but tests like this, and tests in general, whether you're taking the literacy test, whether you're taking an IQ test, whether you're taking the SAT, whatever it is, the conditions that you are in while you take the test greatly affect your performance on the test. So if I give you a test in class, let's say we were sitting in class and I administered a test to you, and I didn't want you to do well, if I just stood over you the whole time and stared at you, and huffed and puffed at you, it would make it very difficult for you to take that test. Whereas if I gave you, your space and made sure that, you were comfortable, the room was the right temperature, that really does change things. So tests are subjective. They are subjective to where you are taking it, and they are subjective to who is giving you this test. It really can alter the outcome. All right, we're almost there, guys. So the last thing to talk about from Reconstruction is Tilden versus Hayes. Samuel Tilden over here on the left is the Democratic candidate, and Rutherford B. Hayes is our Republican candidate. This is a Thomas Nast cartoon, and it says Tilden or blood. And so the Democrats are pretty vocal that if Tilden is not elected, there will be blood in the streets. Blood will run. And by midnight on Election Day, Tilden had 184 of 185 electoral votes to win, and he was leading the popular vote. But there are shenanigans. There's always shenanigans, isn't there? Republicans and Democrats are going to accuse each other back and forth of various kinds of tampering with the election. So Republicans say that Democrats in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina refuse to count African American or any other Republican votes. Democrats say, well, you ignored the Tilden votes. And in Florida, the Republicans claim to have won by 922 votes. The Democrats claimed a 94-vote victory. And then there's also this charge of spilled ink. So it's like you smear ink all over the ballots that you don't want to count. So many shenanigans. My goodness. How will we decide who is our next president? Well, in a way that is similar to, honestly, the corrupt bargain, if you think back. But the Compromise of 1877 happens at the Wormley Hotel, which was an African-American hotel in Washington, D.C. And Rutherford B. Hayes says to Democratic leaders who are invited to this meeting, look, what do you want? What can I do to win the presidency? What do you want from me? And they say, we want the North to stop occupying the South. We want you to go. And so he says, okay. And so here he agrees to withdraw federal troops from the South, provide federal funding for internal improvements, and name a prominent Southerner to the president's cabinet. So then what he is supposed to do is he must pull out troops, and he has to leave the South alone in terms of racial crimes. So this puts Black Southerners in a terrible position, because now the support that they had during the day, which didn't even fully protect them because, the KKK rides at night, And really, I mean, there's not soldiers absolutely everywhere, but it was better when there were soldiers there. Since there are no more soldiers, now the Klan is free to act with impunity. They go out in the middle of the day, and they can have a lynching bee, and we'll get to what that is. And they can just, murder indiscriminately. And while the federal government knows about it, they're not going to do anything about it because that's part of the deal made to end Reconstruction. And this really sets into motion the Jim Crow era in the South. And it really will continue until we get closer to the 1950s and start talking about the civil rights movement. So it is a very long period of time of fear, murder, intimidation, etc. One of the things to think about as you move into the next chapter on the West is that the West and resources out West are something that the country is looking at as a way to move on from Reconstruction, especially the North. So we'll get to that. And I know that in your textbook, in the Industrial America chapters first, I'd like to read the West chapter first, and that's in your syllabus. So hopefully this recorded everything, and you can hear me and not the crow. And I will talk to you soon. Bye, students.